So I'm headed to Mount Sinai Hospital to get my antibody test. We rented a zip car so we could get there safely, and we'll see how it goes.
The test might give you some insight into whether or not what you had was truly COVID-19, and if so, how much antibody we detected in your blood.
Who should get tested, and who should we prioritize?
We are prioritizing known recovered patients because we are hoping for them to donate their plasma to be used as a therapy for people that are in the hospital. Eventually, though, we'll need to use these tests to test other groups to understand how many people in our communities had COVID and recovered who may not even know, or who suspect, like you, that they may have had it but don't know for sure.
Are you planning on testing some people multiple times?
Yes, we need to learn a lot. One thing is, what does having these antibodies mean? Does it protect you from getting COVID-19 again? But assuming that we believe it is protective, we need to know how long that protection will be in place.
I'm a little nervous, but I'll try and be a grown-up.
1, 2, and 3. Okay?
Oh, okay.
You okay? And that's it.
That's it?
That's it.
Oh wow, okay.
Yeah.
That wasn't too bad. I just got an email that my test results are available. I'm weirdly nervous, so I'm gonna log in. Oh my gosh, I'm positive! Antibody assay report positive, and then antibody titer 960, which I think is the threshold for donating plasma. My results came out positive with a titer level of 960. My husband, who was also sick but not as sick as I was, came out positive with a titer level of 320. Why the difference? Am I just better?
So you're on the high side. It may be the timing of when you got the infection, because these things take a bit of time to form.
And for people who would like to donate, what should they expect?
It's more involved than the antibody test. It takes about an hour and a half. They will draw out a volume of blood, and then they give you back your blood cells. At the end, you're left with this kind of yellowish fluid. Once that's done, it gets sent to a hospital and used to treat somebody who's really sick.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.